Hello, my name is Nairi. Welcome to Jovial Whispers. One day in 1973, when my daughter was about 6 months old, I was sitting with her on my lap, having just bathed and dressed her, crying uncontrollably, in deep anxiety for the future of this tiny soul I'd brought into what seemed a very dangerous world. I feared for my precious angel. Her father and I were planning to take her all the way across from Australia to Europe to meet her grandparents, and the excitement of travelling overseas for the first time was well overshadowed by fear. A series of airplane hijackings had taken place since her birth, including one by the Palestinian Liberation Organisation. Plane hijackings were not new. There have been hundreds of attacks throughout the 20th century, but one recently had involved a KLM Boeing plane and another one an Aeroflot flight, so it seemed pretty close to home. The trip from Australia involved 7 stops over a period of 26 hours, one of those stops being in the Middle East, so there was plenty of opportunity for undesirable passengers to embark, and it was somewhat daunting despite the newly introduced security measures at all major airports. I mentioned my fears to my father, who had lived in London during the Second World War and knew how it felt to wake each morning not knowing if you would see another sunrise. He'd worked as an ambulance officer during the Blitz and had survived and borne witness to some pretty horrendous events. Dad's response was simple. Life is dangerous, go and live it. Life is dangerous, go and live it. He was giving me permission to embrace my fears and live life to the full. He was telling me to face my own mortality. What a gift. He lived his own life in the same way and passed away just a few months short of his 90th birthday. I've never forgotten those words, and they've served me well, even to the extent of packing up all my worldly goods and moving to Egypt at the age of 74. We did undertake that trip, and all was well, although we did come face to face with the seriousness of the current threat at Beirut, where we had to disembark, walk across the tarmac to what was then a very small airport. For about 45 minutes, we had to stand inside the terminal building, very tired and somewhat anxious, while the plane was cleaned, inspected and refueled. When we finally re-embarked, we were led with our precious infant through security and across the tarmac again to the gangway, which was flanked on either side by soldiers with machine guns, both within touching distance. Their eyes focused with intense concentration on the hills above Beirut. It was night time and there was nothing to be seen out there. I held my child close to my body to protect her from possible danger and sat down in the plane, scanning each of the new passengers with suspicion and a great deal of anxiety. The next leg of the flight was definitely not relaxing, but at no time did I regret having made the decision to undertake this long trip, my first experience of the world beyond Antipodean shores. Statistically, one was less likely to be caught up in a plane hijack than be involved in a car accident closer to home. But with air flight, there is a sense of powerlessness, lack of any control over one's destiny, which is why it can be so unsettling, although alternatively relaxing depending on the circumstances. And it's a long way to the ground. So I come back to the subject of our mortality, as we understand it in the physical sense. And I come back to the philosophers, which I talked about in my last video. I referred to the Eleusinian mystery schools in particular of around 1400 years BC. And the subjects that were important to philosophers before the late Christian era, when debates turned towards the very existence of God. I mentioned the greater mysteries and the lesser mysteries, which were essentially 2 aspects of the human experience: the earthbound physicality of our existence and the moral and spiritual aspects through which initiates can experience life in a more profound way. Those initiates to the lesser mysteries were subject to a series of often dangerous rites, including being buried alive in a coffin for a period of time or being sent out to sea alone in a boat. Many didn't survive. Why would they face such life-threatening challenges? Well, if that answer isn't obvious, then I would suggest it is to have the experience of facing up to one's mortality, to recognise that death is part of life and inevitable, and to overcome one's fear in order to discover something profound, to recognise that the spirit, however you may define that, is eternal, while the physical body is temporary. Death is only an issue in our consciousness, and if there's nothing on the other side, one is no longer conscious and aware, so why should it matter? Does it matter? In an eternity, what is a short life or a long life? A colleague of my husband on one occasion was discussing the merits of offering university PhDs in music studies with him. The colleague's comment was that money shouldn't be spent on trivial subjects like music because it was just decoration. It should be spent on important things like science. My response to him was, there are only two certainties in life. One is that you are born and the other is that you will die. Everything else in between is decoration. He looked stunned for a moment and then he went into silence. I had the impression that he felt he just heard something quite profound. Past and future only exist in our conscious minds. Many, as I do, believed the only conscious reality is the present moment. At each moment in time, we experience everything at once in our conscious and subconscious minds. At any point in time, we either exist and are conscious, or we don't exist. In the scheme of things, does consciousness matter? Does existence matter? Well, of course it does. We're all of value. We're all important. But in the greater scheme of things, does it matter? There are many stories from people who've had near-death experiences and found them so profound that they no longer fear death. To fear pain is a reasonable emotion based on what we know about our physical reality, but to fear death is irrational unless one believes in the idea of hell. In my experience, most people in nursing homes and some in retirement homes are just waiting for death because they have no use for their physical body, which is failing them. When my late husband first realised his body was failing, he was quite fearful. But as the time for him to finally leave approached, he seemed relaxed and calm, even content. And a friend who passed away from cancer around the age of 70 said to everyone, "Don't cry for me. I've had a wonderful life. I'm content." Is that not what we all want to be able to say when our time comes? I've had a wonderful life. I'm content. She was a fearless soul and did have to an outsider a wonderful life because she embraced it fully through many setbacks and many treasured moments alike. She valued it all. What constitutes a wonderful life? Is that a perception, a myth based on belief rather than knowledge? Or perhaps that belief comes out of a deep knowing, a connection to the total reality of our brief sojourn in a physical body. So once we can accept that reality, how can we find a truth that carries us individually and collectively into some kind of empowerment in our current experience of life? There are many, many people on social media talking about love as the key to living a good life. And while I do agree with them, in terms of my own understanding of the word love, it's clear that a large proportion of our species, for a large proportion of our species, that quality is not available to them. Perhaps they suffer chronic pain, they're poor, they have suffered grave misfortune, They have to deal with a violent person in their lives. They suffer from depression. Whatever the reason, that is a stark reality, and it's not just restricted to the poor and destitute. It can hit anybody. It can be true for many, even those who live a life of privilege. I personally believe that that lack of that emotion we call love is due to fear, but most of us don't even recognise it. I believe many, if not most, of our decisions are based on fear. And I don't mean just fear of death or fear of pain, but those based on the myths that begin to grow from the moment of birth when we absorb our earliest experiences, which are our first connection with physical reality. If they're good experiences, if we happen to be in a healthy physical and emotional environment, then those myths are positive. If that environment is negative, then the myths are negative. But all those experiences create our personal myths, and to live life well, we need to look at them and to find where our truths, or rather universal truths, lie. Let me give you an example based on my own personal experience to demonstrate what I mean. I remember all the way back to the age of around 2 or 3 years old, certainly before I could talk. One memory is of my mother outfitting my Raffia Dolly's pram with a mattress and sheets, and I think she dressed Dolly as well, I can't remember. But shortly after I received them, a doctor arrived to attend to my younger brother who was ill. I lifted up my doll to show him I was so happy, and he indulged me. Then my mother said, "Move out of the way, dear. The doctor has come to see Peter, not you." I remember being very deflated. I remember following my mother and the doctor inside to see my brother propped up in the middle of my parents' double bed, grinning broadly, adoring the attention. That's how it seemed to me. I felt very excluded. My mother's words cut deeply into my young psyche, and it was obvious to me that my brother enjoyed privilege in a way not available to me. I was very young, and that's how I remember it. But additionally, I had a sense from my mother's words that I was of less value, of less importance, even at that young age. I have other memories from those early sensitive years that reinforce that belief, unfortunately. And I became not only very shy as I grew older, but always had difficulty engaging in group conversation because I felt so deeply that I and my needs were not worthy of attention. And that feeling of unworthiness leads to self-sabotage. And it has done so for much of my life, despite the fact that I have a large ego thanks to much indulgence through my beloved father. I always found conversation challenging because of my severe discomfort in the presence of others. And a part of that was feeling different, from feeling as though I lived in a different reality. It's one thing to value one's abilities and achievements, another to feel you as an individual may be of value to others. I did learn to assert myself, but more as an attempt to fight for something that I felt was denied me rather than a given right. Trying to have my needs met always seemed to come out as aggression, as direct confrontation rather than negotiation. There's a difference. If one is confident in one's place in the world, everything is up for negotiation. If one is not confident, then it always feels like entering a battlefield. But let's come back to love, to that emotion which should be empowering. What is that thing we call love? The Greeks have 8 different words for love: erotic love or desire, affection, sacrificial or unconditional love, familial love, obsession, practical or duty-bound love, playful love or courtship, and self-love or self-respect. Self-respect. That's the big one, isn't it? If there's no self-love or self-respect, how can we truly embrace life with that emotion we describe as love? Is love an emotion, or is it a state of conscious awareness, or is it both? I'll come back to self-respect later, but let's look at how fear can function subconsciously in our lives, and I'll revert to an issue which we're all very tired of hearing about, but we mustn't forget because it has virtually changed our world profoundly in ways that are both obvious and obscure, and problematic with regard to our collective future. During the worldwide health scare 3 years ago, people almost universally accepted government regulations about how we were to behave without question. I mentioned earlier about the leap of faith required every time we accept information about matters removed from our first-hand experience. In that particular situation, the important factor is not whether the information we received was true or not, or whether there was a hidden agenda behind it or not, but the fact that it was accompanied by messages which tapped into our deepest fears. And fear-based behaviour isn't rational. Not only were we afraid of something that had the potential to harm us, but there were accompanying fears to compound the situation. We were not only afraid of an apparent hidden enemy, but of one another. We trusted what we were told by a remote authority, but mistrusted one another and ourselves. So what else might we have been afraid of? Fear of being a danger to others, fear of ostracism, fear of being confronted by the police, fear of being arrested, fear of being judged, fear of appearing indifferent to others' welfare, fear of not conforming to the collective, to name just a few. The reality is that we're faced with the possibility of death every day of our lives, from an accident, a stroke, cancer, whatever, but we're so busy getting on with our lives, for the most part, that we just don't think about it. We only think about it when the focus is on one particular thing. The reality of that situation, according to government statistics, and let me tell you what they were, in 2019, more than 300,000 Australians suffered from influenza, and a bit over 1,200 people died, which means 1 in 250 people died from the illness. However, bearing in mind that over 90% of those people were over the age of 80, that brings the statistics for anyone under the age of 80 to about 1 in 12,000. Also bearing in mind that a lot of those people would also have been suffering from chronic illness, which makes us vulnerable, can make you vulnerable to lung problems. That brings the statistics even lower. And in 2020, from the statistics that I saw, the ratios were approximately the same. The flu is also a virus. They're the same kind of illness. Those statistics were in the public realm for all to see. So why were people accepting information from the media and not checking the facts, which was the risk of contracting the disease was actually negligibly low, or at least from suffering serious injury from it. And since the most vulnerable people, the elderly, were mostly in institutions, why were we collectively made to feel responsible for them when they could easily have been isolated from harm? Why were most people prepared to give up their freedom, to stop living life to the full, on the basis of something for whose existence they had no evidence? Why were people so fearful when there are so many more serious dangers in life? Fear Fear of mortality, yes, but many other fears as well. And where does that come from? A belief that one lacks personal power, which I will look into in a later video. Also, lack of knowledge, lack of logical thinking, lack of trust that one will be guided and protected through personal and collective challenges by one's own knowledge and intuition. Acceptance of a myth rather than knowledge. Wanting someone else to be responsible for us. Wanting to be parented. If you tap into anyone's fears, it's very easy to control their behaviour. So what is more important? Self-respect or giving away one's personal power? And what is self-respect? Is it knowing one as being a good citizen by conforming to collective myths, to collective beliefs, whether true or untrue? Or is it knowing oneself and one's place in the greater cosmos and being accountable for one's actions, not through fear but through logic, real knowledge and confidence in one's ability to make good decisions based on logical reason, not only in one's best interests, but in the interests of the collective, trusting our inner wisdom. During the HIV/AIDS scare during the 1980s, the media was full of images of the Grim Reaper, and it was very disturbing. Again, the demographic likely to suffer the illness was the gay community, as we called it then. But there was great pressure on the general population to take precautions through intravenous means. Why was that? It didn't affect most of us. It was never discussed among my acquaintances. Nobody thought to question why. I think of the overused but very relevant quote in another context by Benjamin Franklin. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Harsh words and in a different context, but still very relevant as our privacy and freedoms are being constantly eroded to the point where we will be driven into a total slavery if we don't collectively wake up to that reality. Of course, most of us want to live as long as possible, but at what cost? When we accept mortality as part of life, then the question is not how long we live, but how well we live, how empowered and enriched we are. Does that suggest to you, as it does to me, that not only should we look deeply inside ourselves to find those fears and purge them, but also to look at the quality of parenting of new generations of adults, the children, who can think independently and with confidence? There are obvious things to look at, such as not administering physical punishment and being supportive, but being careful with one's language is important as well, as I demonstrated earlier with my experience. When I see parents praising their children for small accomplishments as though they're heroic, I cringe, because that is just as damaging as negative feedback, because it encourages self-aggrandizement, but also a fear of falling short of expectations. It's really a form of virtue signalling based on, yes, fear of being judged for one's parental skills or lack thereof. To me, any value judgment about behaviour, provided that behaviour is socially acceptable and in the person's best interests and others, is unhealthy, except in situations where a desired outcome is achieved, such as in sports and other competitions. Then, of course, praise is due for effort. But the only valuable standard really to aim for is improvement, for the best version of our personal selves, not praise or criticism. If we want to maintain a world that is designed for human occupation rather than that of robots and slaves, then we need to look at the children. Of course, they must know about digital technology and artificial intelligence. It's a fact of life. But they need also to learn other skills and understand what it is that makes us human. The brain needs to be in balance, the practical and the intuitive. Creative activities encouraging thinking skills, spiritual understanding and experiential knowledge are vital to the development of both sides of the brain, not one at the expense of the other. You know, all of the things I talk about here are matters I've been faced with and thought about for many years. But I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that I have the answers, that I've solved those issues within myself. In fact, probably the opposite. I have my own biases and often suffer from extreme anxiety. I'm sure it's a rare soul who is totally reciprocal in their thinking. But recognising one's own ignorance is a step towards gaining knowledge and becoming more empowered. Because when we operate through a position of ignorance, we're very vulnerable to manipulation. I see so many comments on social media from people who are clearly conceited and complacent in their own ignorance, whose egos are so inflated they fall into the trap of point scoring rather than contributing useful information that will lead to some sort of consensus. I don't want to fall into that trap, even though I probably do sometimes. And I'm sure you feel the same way. That's why you're here. Let's lead one another into greater wisdom and effectiveness in an amazing world that still holds room for improvement. Thank you for joining me. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can do so on my website, nairij.com, and also find a little bit about me there, see my artworks, listen to a little bit of my music, read a few articles, and for free, the first chapter of my book, Jovial Whispers. I hope you found some connection with what I've shared today. Until next time, stay well, stay blessed.